Hello, it's Edward Earl from Zeus Coach. I want to run a quick tip by you when it comes to being more consistent with your ground strokes, especially your forehand. One of the things that happens when we grip the racket, whether that's a continental grip, an Eastern grip, Roger Federer's modified Eastern, a semi-Western, or a full Western, the objective is it's all really about physics. The more mass you have hitting the ball with the speed of the racket, that impact is going to create a heavier ball, a deeper ball, and a faster ball. So that being said, the only way people generally try to get more mass on the racket or on the ball or in the swing is to swing a heavier racket. And that's not necessarily the case. You can use a lighter racket, but here's a technique that I teach top juniors and just about everybody I coach. Where you place your fingers on the racket makes a big difference. So for example, a lot of pros will leave this pinky off to get a little more leverage. They don't use a 27.5-inch racket. Some do, okay, but most don't. But the main thing is this particular pointer finger. This pointer finger, what I call the laser finger or the guide finger, is really what determines the path of the racket, which therefore determines the path of the ball. So if you take the racket out and you kind of made a hand like this and you swung, the objective is to use the finger as if it's the actual racket. And so when you do that and you make that path with that finger, that's what creates the path of the racket, which creates the path of the ball. Adding more mass, if you keep your fingers together like this on the racket, you will have a certain amount of mass on that racket. It's just the laws of physics. But if you separate that finger a little bit, you start adding more equivalent mass to the frame, therefore hitting a heavier ball because you've got more contact on your fingers throughout the base of the racket. That makes a huge difference. So a little bit of separation adds a lot more mass. If you separate it more out this way where you've got two fingers in between, okay, you can see that, you've got two fingers in between, what happens, you add about 20 to 25% more equivalent mass on the shot. Makes a huge difference, especially if you're hitting the ball flat through. If you're in a return and you don't get that big swing and you want a little bit more mass on a heavy serve, separate that by two fingers and all of a sudden you'll see that ball connecting with the racket and it'll feel so much more solid. In addition to that, if you're flattening the ball out because you want to drive a forehand home, then obviously you want to separate by two fingers, adding 20-25% more equivalent mass to the racket. Therefore the connectivity in the ball is so much heavier and so much more trick that you end up doing is this, is you can on rally balls, what I call C1 balls, consistency balls, is to pull the finger not off like this, but just lift it off and therefore just hit. And you're guiding the frame and the path of the racket with the finger, but the finger is generally off like this, okay? And what that does is it reduces the mass on the racket, and when you can swing away at that ball, but the mass is not as big and not as great, so therefore the ball will lose some of its depth and some of its penetration. So therefore what happens is you can really swing away, because a lot of times when we get in tense situations we over grip, and this allows us to compensate for that tenseness and that nervousness and the opportunity for us to over grip. It eliminates that and allows those C1 or consistency or rally balls to go in more. Another time I suggest to use that is when you're hitting extreme topspin and you're hitting up on the ball. You might want to take that finger off because it'll release the racket better in the wrist and it'll cause more revolutions and more topspin. So remember, when those circumstances happen, you can add or take away mass on the racket, which equivalently is like adding more weight to the racket by simply keeping your fingers together, moving them one finger apart, two fingers apart, or removing the front finger, the forefinger, the pointer, or the laser finger off of the racket altogether. So work with that a little bit and hit some balls and see what happens, and I think you're going to be really amazed at the differences in the strokes and the ball patterns when you change the placement of the finger just a little bit. Thanks so much.